He won her in a card game. That was the sentence people in Cottonwood Reach would later settle on, because it fit neatly inside a mouth, because it let men tell the story without lowering their voices. Words like that worked the way distance worked. Stretch them far enough, and even something ugly could start to look ordinary. He won her in a card game, and by sunrise, she was kneeling in his field, hands pressed into the dirt, dress dark with soil, breathing slow and measured, like someone who had learned long ago what panic cost and could not afford to pay it again. Mist lay low across Ashwood Valley, thin as breath on glass. The mountains beyond were slate blue and soft-edged, as if the world hadn't finished waking yet. A narrow ribbon of water cut through a shallow furrow, catching the first light in broken flashes. Yellow wildflowers burned quietly along the fence line, stubborn and bright, blooming where no one had asked them to. Maeve knelt close to that water. Sleeves rolled, hair fallen loose from a knot that hadn't survived the night. Her dress, dark red once, now faded by dust and road miles, was already stained at the knees. A short distance behind her, near the fence rail, Silas Boone sat on a white horse. The animal stood patient and still, ears flicking at the sounds of morning. Silas held the reins loosely, not because he was careless, but because he did not want his hands to look like ownership. From a distance, it was a picture the frontier had painted 1,000 times. A woman on her knees, a man watching from a saddle. A story old enough to stop asking questions. Anyone riding past might have believed they understood exactly what they were seeing, but they would have been wrong. Because 12 hours earlier, Silas Boone hadn't come to Cottonwood Reach looking to gamble, and the woman kneeling in his soil had already learned what it meant to be wagered by men who did not see her as human. And when Silas said, "I'll take the hand," in a smoke-choked saloon full of witnesses, even he didn't know whether he had just saved her life or stepped into something that would cost him everything he had left. The Cottonwood Reach saloon was loud, the way desperate places are loud. Noise stacked on noise, as if sound itself was trying to drown something out. A piano stumbled through the same tired tunes, the player's fingers moving out of habit more than joy. Boots scraped sawdust across the floor. Glass clinked. Laughter burst out too fast and too hard. The kind meant to prove a man still had teeth. The air was thick with cigar smoke, whiskey breath, and the sour tang of coats that hadn't been clean in days. Silas Boone stood near the bar, with a single drink he hadn't finished. He looked like a man shaped by seasons rather than ambition. Broad-shouldered, but not in the way of brawlers or drifters. Broad in the way of someone who split his own wood and hauled water uphill even when the snow came early. His clothes were plain. His boots mended more than once. His hands scarred and calloused, knuckles thick, nails broken short. His face carried lines carved by wind and sun rather than laughter. He hadn't come to town to be seen. He'd come for flour, salt, lamp oil. Things a man couldn't grow or forge, no matter how stubborn he was. And because sometimes the silence up on the mountain pressed so hard against his ribs, it felt like it might cave him in. Sometimes a man needed noise just to remember he still belonged to the world. He meant to drink once and leave. Then he heard the words. "I'm out of cash," a man said lightly. Too lightly. "But I got something better." Silas turned toward the poker table. Rourke Allen sat there with his hat tipped back and his smile tipped forward. The kind of smile that suggested the world owed him something, and he intended to collect. Dust clung to his boots. Sweat darkened his collar. His eyes shone with that dangerous brightness gamblers got when they had already crossed the line and couldn't remember where it was. Men leaned in, smelling entertainment. "What do you got?" the dealer asked. Rourke chuckled. "She's in my wagon." The saloon didn't fall silent all at once. It faltered. The piano missed a note. A chair scraped, then stopped. Smoke hung under the rafters like the air itself had decided to listen. Some men looked away quickly, like if they didn't see it, it wouldn't be their problem. Others leaned closer, curiosity overpowering decency. A few smirked, already telling themselves it was none of their business. From a booth near the center, Edwin Hale leaned forward. Hale didn't shout. He didn't laugh. He didn't need to. He was the wealthiest landholder in 3 counties, a man who wore clean cuffs and carried power in ink and signatures instead of fists. Judges nodded when he entered a room. Deputies adjusted their belts. "Bring her in," Hale said calmly, like ordering another drink. Rourke stood and made a show of it. A minute later he came back through the saloon doors, dragging a woman by the wrist. Not yanking her with rage, worse than that. Dragging her with casual impatience, like she was a sack of grain that had snagged on the floor. She stumbled once and caught herself. Her wrists were raw where rope had bitten into them, red and swollen. Her hair hung loose and tangled. Her dress was plain and travel-worn, hem stained with road dust and old mud. She looked like someone who hadn't slept properly in far too long. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. She didn't lift her head. Her eyes stayed fixed on the floorboards, as if counting knots in the wood was safer than meeting faces. Whispers rippled through the room. Hale studied her the way a man studied livestock. Posture, hands, shoulders, already calculating profit. "Not much value there," he said dismissively. "You're finished, Allen." Rourke shrugged. "Someone'll want her." No one spoke. Not because no one did. Because no one wanted to say it first. The woman's shoulders drew inward, folding herself smaller. She didn't plead. Experience had taught her pleading was just another performance, and performances didn't change outcomes. Silas Boone felt something tighten in his chest. 7 years earlier, he had stood behind his cabin staring at 2 fresh graves. One belonged to his wife, one to the child she had carried long enough for him to imagine a future. Fever had taken them both in the same week. After that, Silas learned how quiet could become a weight, how loneliness didn't always scream. Sometimes it hollowed a man out until there wasn't much left but habit and breath. He thought grief had burned tenderness out of him. But watching that woman stand there like property, waiting to change hands, stirred something older than grief, a refusal. Not loud, not dramatic, just a hard, immovable no rising behind his ribs. "I'll take the wager," Silas said. The table froze. Then the room erupted. Laughter, surprise, a slap on the table, a few curses. Hale raised an eyebrow, amused. "Boone," he said thinly, "that's the worst bargain you'll ever make." Silas didn't answer. "Deal," he said. The dealer hesitated, then dealt. Rourke played recklessly, betting hard on weak hands, chasing luck like it owed him something. Silas played slow, folding when the odds turned and holding when patience mattered. When the final card hit the table, the outcome was clear. Silas Boone had won. For a moment, silence. Then the room decided its story. Not that Silas had saved her. No. That Silas Boone was a fool. Rourke slammed his palm down. Hell of a way to ruin yourself. Silas stood. Give me the rope. Rourke hesitated, then yanked it loose and shoved it into Silas's hand. He grabbed the money, downed his drink, and staggered out. The crowd drifted away. Silas Boone stood alone with the woman everyone else had already dismissed. "What's your name?" he asked quietly. It took a moment. "Maeve," she said. "I'm Silas Boone. I live above Ashwood Valley. It's small, but you'll be safe there. That's all I can promise." She didn't answer, but she followed him. Before the road carried them into the dark, before the saloon noise faded behind them. Understand this. If you're drawn to stories where one quiet decision changes two lives, where dignity is rebuilt in dust and patience instead of gunfire, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. These long frontier stories survive because people like you stay with them. Outside, the night had teeth. Silas draped his coat over Maeve's shoulders. She flinched, bracing for pain that didn't come, then froze. He helped her onto his horse and rode with space between them. By the time they reached the cabin, she was asleep. The days that followed were not gentle. They were repetitive, demanding, unforgiving in the way only honest work can be. Silas did not expect trust to arrive all at once. He had lived too long to believe in sudden mercies. Trust, he knew, came the way seasons did. Slow, uneven, impossible to rush. Maeve rose before dawn every morning, not because Silas asked her to, and never because she felt obligated. She rose because the land itself demanded attention before the sun burned moisture away. She stepped outside, while frost still clung to the grass, breath visible in the cold, and walked the field slowly, deliberately, as if she were reading something written beneath the surface. She learned the slope with her feet, where water wanted to run, where it wanted to stay but could not. She knelt often, pressing her palms flat against the soil, feeling its resistance, its refusal, its quiet potential. When she spoke, it was never rushed. "The ground isn't dead," she said one morning, almost to herself. "It's just been misunderstood." Silas worked a few yards behind her, repairing fence posts that had leaned too long in the wind, clearing brush that had choked the edges of the field, hauling water from the creek in heavy buckets that cut into his palms. He did not interrupt her. He had spent years trying to bend this land into obedience. Watching her listen to it felt like witnessing a language he had never learned. They spoke little at first, not because silence was awkward, but because it was careful. Maeve conserved words the way hungry people conserved bread. Silas recognized the instinct immediately. Grief had taught him the same economy. Some things, once said, could never be taken back. Better to wait until they mattered. At night, Maeve sat at the table with a small, leather-bound notebook and wrote by lamplight. Her pencil moved slowly, deliberately, as if each mark carried weight. Silas never asked what she recorded, never leaned close enough to see. He had learned that safety was built less by protection than by restraint. The cabin began to change in small, almost imperceptible ways. A second cup drying by the basin, extra firewood stacked near the stove without discussion, footprints beside his own at the door. None of it announced itself. None of it asked permission, and the land began to respond. Not dramatically, not all at once. The soil loosened. Earthworms returned, quiet proof of life beneath the surface. Water soaked in instead of cutting scars downhill. Green pushed up in places Silas had abandoned years earlier, tentative at first, then stronger. The valley noticed before the town did. By early summer, riders slowed their horses when they passed Boone's place. They stared at the strange planting patterns, curves instead of straight lines, clusters instead of lonely stalks. Some shook their heads and spat. Others looked longer, unsettled by the fact that it was working. The first visitors were not men. They were women, farm wives from down the valley, faces weathered by wind and disappointment, hands cracked from labor that never seemed to pay back what it took. They came in pairs or threes, bringing children and quiet questions wrapped in embarrassment. Maeve welcomed them without ceremony. She knelt in their soil the same way she had knelt in Silas's. She touched it, smelled it, explained without judgment, without pride. She spoke of water tables and root depth, of plants that protected one another instead of competing. Silas watched something shift in those women as they listened. Shoulders straightened, eyes sharpened. They were not being lectured. They were being invited to understand. Word traveled the way it always did in small places, through kitchens, across fence lines, in voices lowered just enough to sound important. By midsummer, it reached Cottonwood Reach, and men like Edwin Hale noticed. Hale did not ride up the mountain himself. That would have required effort, and Hale preferred leverage. Instead, papers arrived. Notices written in clean ink and polite language. They claimed Maeve Caldwell was property, claimed contracts, claimed ownership with the confidence of someone unused to refusal. Silas read the paper once, folded it carefully, handed it back. "No," he said. That single word marked the beginning of the storm. Deputies began riding past more often. Men in town asked questions that were not really questions. Rumors took shape, about stolen methods, about unlawful claims, about a woman who had no right to speak with authority. Maeve slept lightly during those weeks, waking at every unfamiliar sound. Silas noticed. He began keeping his rifle closer at night, not because he wanted violence, but because he refused to be surprised. Silas rode farther than he ever had before. He followed old trails to farms that had lost land through technicalities. He listened to widows who kept contracts folded in tin boxes because something about them had never felt right. He spoke to men who had tried to fight Hale and learned that fists did not matter when judges owed favors. Maeve organized everything Silas brought back. Dates, signatures, boundary descriptions. Patterns emerged slowly, unmistakably. Hale had been stealing land for decades. One night, Silas returned after dark with blood on his sleeve. Riders had followed him down a gulch road. He barely escaped by riding hard through terrain his pursuers did not know. Maeve stitched the wound without shaking. "I won't lose another person to him," she said quietly. The hearing came in autumn. The courthouse filled beyond expectation. Farmers, shopkeepers, women Maeve had helped, men who had eaten from soil she healed. They sat shoulder to shoulder, silent and resolute. Hale arrived confident, clean, smiling like the outcome had already been decided. One document at a time. The truth stacked higher than money. Forged signatures, duplicate contracts, bribes recorded in ledgers Hale never expected anyone to see. When the ruling came, it was quiet. Hale's claim was voided, his contracts exposed, his power broken not by gunfire, but by witnesses who refused to look away. Hale was arrested that afternoon. It should have felt like an ending. Instead, it felt like the moment a tree finally toppled after years of leaning, loud, final, and somehow still not enough to quiet what it had been doing to the ground around it. Outside the courthouse, people did not cheer. Not really. A few mouths opened, as if they might, then closed again. The frontier did not trust joy. It had watched too many celebrations turn into funerals. Men stood in clusters, hats in their hands, eyes tracking Hale as deputies guided him toward the wagon. Hale's face stayed composed, almost bored, as if he were merely being inconvenienced. That composure was the last tool he had left. If he could look untouched, perhaps the town would believe he still was. But Maeve saw it. A twitch at the jaw. The slightest stiffness in his shoulders. The way his gaze moved over the crowd, not searching for sympathy, but counting. Measuring who would still answer his name. Silas stood beside Maeve without touching her. Not because he didn't want to, because he still understood what touch could mean to someone whose body had been treated like a receipt. The sheriff cleared his throat and spoke to no one in particular. His holdings will be reviewed, he said. Land claims, contracts, might take months. Months. The word hung there like smoke. Maeve's hands were folded tightly in front of her. Silas noticed the knuckles whitening. She had won the right to breathe as her own person, and already the world was telling her there would be paperwork attached to it. As Hale was lifted into the wagon, his eyes finally found Maeve. Not with hatred, with something colder. A look that said, "You may have won today, but you are still standing in a world built by men like me." Then he looked away. That hurt more than the gaze itself. Indifference was his last attempt to erase her. The wagon rolled. Hooves clopped. The town watched until the dust swallowed him. Only then did the murmurs begin. Quiet. Cautious. Some people came to Maeve with trembling gratitude. Others kept their distance, as if standing too close to her might invite Hale's shadow to return. A man in a clean vest, one of Hale's lesser partners, spat near the steps and muttered about outsiders and women stirring trouble. His voice wasn't loud, but it was loud enough to be heard. Silas turned his head, eyes flat. The man swallowed the rest of his words. Not everyone in Cottonwood Reach had benefited from Hale's system, but enough had tasted its safety that they feared living without it. Hale was a poison, yes, yet poison, taken long enough, starts to feel like medicine. That was the danger now. Not Hale in chains, but the town's hunger to replace him with someone else. Maeve and Silas rode out before dusk. The valley road felt different on the way back up the mountain. Quieter, as if the land itself were listening to see whether the decision would hold. Maeve sat straight-backed, eyes forward. Silas could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she held herself ready for the sudden appearance of riders. When the cabin finally came into view, Maeve exhaled a breath she had been holding since morning. Inside, she did not collapse into relief. She went to the table. She opened her notebook. Silas watched her write, the pencil moving with sharp, controlled strokes. "What are you doing?" he asked. Maeve didn't look up. Making sure it stays true, she said. Silas felt something settle inside him, heavy, resolute. He had thought winning the hearing meant they could return to quiet, but Maeve understood something he was still learning. Quiet was never given. It was defended. The next weeks proved her right. A deputy arrived with additional forms. A clerk asked Maeve to repeat her statement for accuracy. A man in town refused to sell Silas seed unless he paid twice the price. Someone left a dead crow on a fence post down the ridge road. A warning dressed up as superstition. Silas did not talk much about it. He just began taking longer routes when he rode. He checked the tree line more often. He kept his rifle clean and close. Maeve, for her part, did not shrink. She kept teaching valley women what she knew. She kept walking fields, kept kneeling in other people's dirt, hands steady, eyes clear. Because Hale's power had not only been in what he stole, it had been in what he convinced people to accept. If Maeve stopped now, his lesson would survive him. One evening, as the air sharpened and the first hints of winter crept into the wind, Maeve stood on the porch, looking down the valley. "I keep waiting," she said softly. "For what?" Silas asked. "For the part where it's over," she admitted. Silas stared out at the darkening hills. "It doesn't end," he said. "It just changes shape." Maeve's fingers tightened around the porch rail. "And if it comes back?" she asked. Silas didn't answer right away. Then he said simply, "Then it finds us standing." Winter followed hard and early. Snow buried the valley. The cabin stood against the cold. The cellar stayed full. Evenings were spent by lamplight. Maeve read from her father's journals. Silas spoke of his wife for the first time. Voice rough, but steady. Grief did not vanish. It softened. When spring returned, it did not arrive all at once. It came the way healing often does, uneven, uncertain, with mornings that still carried winter's bite. Frost clung to the low ground before dawn. The creek ran high with meltwater, loud enough at night to wake Silas, rushing downhill as if it were trying to escape the mountains altogether. Maeve felt the change before she saw it. She stood alone in the field one morning, mist curling around her calves, and pressed her palm flat against her belly. The realization did not arrive with joy at first, but with stillness, with the careful mental inventory of someone who had learned not to trust good news until it proved it could survive the day. She did not tell Silas immediately. Instead, she worked. She planted where the soil held warmth longest. She adjusted the water channels, reinforcing them with stones Silas carried up from the creek. She planned for seasons that would come after the next one. Her body moved with a quiet deliberateness, as if some part of her already understood that nothing would be allowed to waste. Silas noticed the changes before she spoke, the way she paused more often to breathe, the way her hand rested unconsciously at her side, the way her gaze lingered on the far edges of the field, as if she were measuring space rather than ground. One evening, after supper, Maeve set her cup down with unusual care. "I need to tell you something," she said. Silas stilled, every instinct honed by loss tightening his chest. She took his hand, not hesitantly, not as a question, but as a fact. "There's a life coming," she said quietly. For a moment, Silas did not understand the words. Then understanding hit him all at once. He laughed, an unsteady sound, like it hadn't been used in years. Then his breath broke, and tears followed, unchecked and unashamed. He pressed his forehead against her knuckles, grounding himself in the simple proof of warmth and presence. Maeve watched him carefully, braced for fear, for doubt. Instead, he looked up with something like awe. "We'll figure it out," he said. "We always do." The valley bloomed again that year, stronger than before. Word spread, not just of crops, but of fairness, of land that was being returned properly, of a woman who taught without charging, and a man who stood without posturing. People came not just to learn, but to stay a while, to work, to help. The mountain that had once felt isolated began to feel anchored. Late one afternoon, Maeve stood in the same place she had knelt that first morning, hands once trembling, eyes once lowered. The field stretched out before her in green rows and gentle curves, alive with wind and insects and promise. Silas watched from the porch, the white horse grazing nearby. He understood now that nothing in this life had been given to him. Not the land, not peace, not the woman standing in the field. All of it had been earned, and because it had been earned, it would endure.